All right, so now you have been warned. This meeting is being recorded, uh, and we are glad to have you join us from all across the nation. This is way of introduction. My name is David Burton. I am a county engagement specialist with University of Missouri Extension. I am sort of the facilitator for this program, this Neighboring 101 class. I am in Springfield, Missouri, is where I'm headquartered. We're enjoying some beautiful weather here today. Now, here's kind of what to expect today on this format. We're going to do just kind of a general introduction at the beginning. That's going to be about 5 minutes. We're going to talk about just briefly a little pilot project we have going on here that might be of interest to some of you as well, maybe 5 minutes on that. Each time we meet, we try and highlight a book that might be of interest to you that's kind of connected to this topic of neighboring. We have a book this week we're going to talk about just briefly, probably 10 minutes, called The Turquoise Table. And we'll send in the follow-up to this meeting. In that email, there'll be a link to a longer video about that book. And then our guest speaker today is Dr. Sarah Massengale. She's with the University of Missouri. She'll be talking about social capital and how that connects to this idea of neighboring. She couldn't be here live, so we're going to watch the YouTube interview we have with her. And then at the end, we always allow time for question and answer, whether that's questions that you have of each other or questions of me, doing that through chat or through the microphones, opening up your microphones and asking questions. We want to have that type of dialogue. We think that makes that a lot of fun. Well, to begin with, I'm going to ask a poll of you. Some of you may have seen in the news recently that a family in Michigan received an anonymous letter from a neighbor asking them to take down their Christmas lights. Actually, it turns out several neighbors got an anonymous letter from neighbors. So here's the question. Have you ever sent an anonymous letter to a neighbor? Now, be honest, we're not tracking your actual answer. That's why we gave you the option of refusing to answer on the grounds that it might incriminate you in case you're really hesitant. But have you ever sent an anonymous letter to a neighbor? Weigh in if you can here. It looks like that's a good part of you. Well, you know, we have at least one person who's really willing to be honest on this. So it's not an anomaly. Someone actually fessed up to that. And I'm just going to help this person feel even more comfortable and admit that my wife and I were discussing this last night. 21 or 22 years ago, I also sent an anonymous letter to a neighbor. Now, would I handle that differently now? Yes, I would. But I was much younger then. That's my excuse. So hopefully, if you're connected with your neighbors, you're learning their names, and you're connected in other ways, you won't feel a need to send an anonymous letter. But that still is in the news some and goes on from time to time, I guess. So, well, thanks for joining on that poll, and welcome to Neighboring 101. These are free classes. They're designed to help educate people about the power of neighboring, kind of showcase some examples of the neighboring movement all across North America. We'll be looking at research on the topic. Hopefully this will be motivating to you and other individuals to pursue some type of neighboring activity to improve your communities, your neighborhoods, and your own quality of life as well. We recognize that neighborhoods can make communities vibrant and welcoming and great places to live, work, and play. Last month, we heard from Midland, Michigan, and I think we heard loud and clear from them about how neighboring has helped to make that community more welcoming. That's certainly an important aspect. So if you haven't seen that video, that is available in the reminder emails that go back and watch that. So one of the advantages of being live today is the Q&A at the end. So if you have some questions, save those up. We'll be trying to answer those. If we can't answer them online, or if other people don't have ideas to chime in, we'll add that to the list to try and address later as the program goes or as this process continues. So as we begin today, if you wouldn't mind, please share in chat maybe a little, it's kind of nice to know where people are from, but it's really nice to know why you're interested in this topic of neighboring. I know we have a few connected with Habitat for Humanity, so that may be a common connection for some, but others of you may have other reasons for being interested in this topic of neighboring. We do keep these chat streams, and this kind of helps us formulate ideas for future programs. Although we have the next 4 classes lined up, it kind of helps us think about what we do beyond that. Go ahead and share in chat. A few with local government connections. All right, good to see that. A varied background, it looks like, from all over. Well, I think the neat thing about neighboring, as I've been learning over the course of 2 years, is it applies in a lot of different settings. It's not just like one area of interest. And really, in the bigger picture, I guess, if you have someplace to live, that means all of us have neighbors, whether we're in an apartment complex or subdivision. This applies to us as individuals as well as the bigger group may be applying to our work. And I know several of you are grassroots community interest, and whether it's a big town or a small town, we're great. It's good to have that interest. It applies all across the board. You're going to find, I'm going to share a link here. You're going to find on our website, you'll be able to get access to a chart that you can use that really helps you get to know your neighbors. This is something that I'll share with you what that looks like here. This is, you can actually download a PDF of this. This idea is kind of modeled after something that originated in Dave Runyon's book, The Art of Neighboring. And the idea here is to use this chart to learn and remember and use the names of your neighbors. And I can tell you that my own experience is that this makes a big difference. I'm not always really good at remembering names. And you got to be able to remember them to be able to use them. And to be able to use them makes a big difference. It helps, it really impacts your ability to have a relationship. It really is a springboard if you can use their name. And this is really a simple process. Dave Runyon described it. Well, it's a practical and simple process to just take a chart, start keeping track of names and using them. Lots of times in leadership programs, you'll hear that a leader wants to set the bar high to help bring other people up to that bar, up to that high level. Well, in this case, this chart is so low that it's hard to crawl under. I mean, we're not setting it high. We're setting the bar really low. Take this. You may surprise yourself on how few neighbors you know by name, and then set that as a goal to get to learn those names. And it can make all the difference in the world.
David, I got a quick question.
Yes.
I saw your example in the tutorial. It looks like you had typed yours in a document and printed it out. I'm wondering, do you have visuals or examples of other neighbors that have utilized that? And are they using pencil for renters or homeowners that may move in or move out? And what other sorts of details are they including, or that they think are valuable? Is it pets names? Are they actually putting down hobbies or interests and the one fact about a neighbor like you've addressed as well?
Hey, that is a great question. And honestly, I guess I've not seen I've talked to other people that have used the chart, and I hear the stories about it, but I guess I've not seen how they've actually done it. If they've used pen, pencil, or whatever. In my case, just because I'm a little OCD at times, I have that chart and I've typed everything out, and we keep it up on the refrigerator. So mine is neat. I guess the other reason for doing that is you probably couldn't read my handwriting. Um, so we include names, we include phone numbers, so we can call them easily, text them. We don't include facts on the list, but we just have kind of talked about them as a family. But that's a good idea. I think providing that grid is just maybe an easy tool, but it may be something you want to take and refine in a way that fits your interest.
Sure. You also mentioned the refrigerator. I think the Art of Neighboring book has an option to purchase fridge magnets.
Yes, they do. They do. And they're not very expensive. They're like 99 cents, I think.
I think they're like 50 cents. You might have to buy a minimum of 50. Yeah, I think I'd be certainly curious to see how other folks are practically using those on a day-to-day basis, and where they put them. Are they putting them on their fridges or where?
Yes. Well, groups that I have spoken to here in Springfield and this surrounding area, this is the first thing that we go to is this chart. And the first thing I encourage a board or a group of leaders to do, go do this yourself. You have to be doing this yourself and kind of seeing the impact this makes before you can tell other people to go do it. And there is an impact. I'm a walking testimony to that. It makes a tremendous difference. It takes a little time to develop those relationships, but without the names, you can't do it. And Dave Runyon will say, the way they measured whether or not people knew their neighbors was, do they know their name? Do they know a fact about them? And have they spoke to them in the last month? And in their research communities, they found that about 3% of Americans could say yes to all three of those questions. So we definitely have a neighboring crisis problem, but it is something that can be repaired. And so we showcase that chart. So, check out our website if you want to download that, or email me. I'm glad to send you a PDF. It's for sharing and for use. And then, like Chet suggested, I guess I would love to see other people's charts sometime. I'd love to see how you're using that and how you're moving forward with it. Well, I did want to tell one other seasonal story, and this is in keeping with the season. Some people will say they don't talk with their neighbors, or when they do communicate with their neighbors, or they take them gifts or things, they worry if there'll be any reciprocation. If people really want to be friended, how people are going to respond. Are they going to even speak to me? And there's a great research study that was done in 1974. Phil Kuntz was his name, and his family got a record number of Christmas cards that year. And you can see several stories of this online. Many of those letters they got were very personal. Things like, "Dear Phil, Joyce, and family, we received your holiday greeting with much joy and enthusiasm. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Love, Bev and the children." The thing is, it seems normal, but he was a sociologist at Brigham Young University, and he experimented to see what would happen if he sent Christmas cards to 600 strangers selected at random. And he sent them all a handwritten card with a picture of his family. And then he waited to see what would happen. And 5 days later, the responses started coming in. And over the course of several weeks, he got Christmas cards from 1/3 of the strangers, complete random strangers. What this illustrates is that what sociologists call the rule of reciprocity. It's the type of thing that when you meet someone in the hallway, a complete stranger, and they say hello, you say hello back. That's an example of this rule of reciprocity. It happens in other ways. Apparently, and at least in 1974, was still happening with Christmas cards. That might not be the case today. Not as many people send cards, but that is still a sizable portion. And I think that applies in neighboring. I have found that uh, no one seemed upset about contacting them, trying to learn names. And in most of the cases, that kindness and that connection has been reciprocated. So it seems to apply in this area of neighboring. Uh, one other question for the group here. Um, Another little moment of honesty. So if you ended up in the mail, if you got a Christmas card from a stranger, would you reciprocate with a card on your own?
Were these cards personally addressed to you, or was it like a
Oh,
bulk?
that you feel like that? Yeah, that would make a difference, wouldn't it? Well, yeah, the sociologist in this example, Phil, they hand wrote them. They hand wrote the letters and the notes.
Thanks.
That's a good point. Well, this may be a highly engaged group to ask this question to, perhaps, um, especially since you already heard the story, I guess. We'll cut that off and share the results. Looks like, a little over 50% of you say you probably would respond. And if the situation was the same, if it was handwritten, include a picture of this nice family, you would reciprocate. That's an interesting thing to think about, this rule of reciprocity and how that applies then to neighboring and how people respond and what we can expect from them. Our book of the month to profile to you is by Kristen Schnell. It is The Turquoise Table. And just bring that to your attention as well. There are lots of books available on neighboring topics. This is one I read a while back. Every book you read, you try and look for that snippet that you can take away. There's some things about this book that I don't really relate to. I'm not a stay-at-home mom. I don't homeschool my kids, so that's her background. So there's some things in this I don't relate to. I don't do a lot of cooking, so recipes aren't really my thing either. But her story about how they ended up with a picnic table in their front yard and how that became the connection point for their whole community is a really interesting story. And in the follow-up email, we'll have a link to a video about how that has been applied in Dent County, Missouri, and what they have tried to do around this idea of conversation tables, turquoise tables, and getting people connected and talking together. So it's other communities may do other things, or other people may take other approaches individually. I know for my family, I brought up the idea of a turquoise table in my front yard. It was not well received. And so after some thought and discussion during COVID season, we started doing what we called Front Yard Fridays. And so we had dinner on the driveway lots of times when the weather was nice, just in our lawn chairs. And that became a connection point with neighbors, people out walking dogs, people coming by. Normally on a Friday, we would have been in the house, eating a pizza, watching a movie, probably. That's a favorite thing. But this was instead of the picnic table, this seemed to be a good option that worked for us. And it might work in your situation as well.
David,
well, those are some.
I've heard of Front Porch Fridays as a similar thing, and I think the takeaway there is that it's a reoccurring event that people can look forward to, and they may not make it every Friday. I know I've done a series of events that's like the first Wednesday of the month. And again, people may not make it every month, but it's a reoccurring event and it's something that they can look forward to. And there is a regular opportunity to engage and interact with their immediate neighbors. So I think that's the biggest takeaway that I hear from
That's,
your front yard Fridays.
well, that's a good additional thought there about keeping them regular or having a consistent schedule to them.
Right. And I'll as an alternative, my folks live on a block where they have a once a year block party, and there's been a couple years where they were out of town or they had a prior engagement, and that didn't make the cut. So they would go a couple years before there was a scheduled event to come together with their neighbors. Hence, whereas a a biweekly or monthly or quarterly seasonal event would give more opportunities, more regular opportunities for people to come together.
Yeah. Okay. With some regularity. You know, the front yard Fridays is just kind of what we called it in our family, and we'd laugh about it as people came by and visited. But I can see there being some value in having something kind of set, scheduled. And I love names that kind of rhyme, because we've done donuts on the driveway and goodies in the garage and some things like that just from our own house is how we kind of ended up with front yard Fridays. But yeah, a regular schedule, something that people could expect and plan around even, and perhaps come to anticipate. That's probably another great suggestion, great idea. Well, these are all some of the bonus things, I guess, that we've been leaned to. We'll get to the video now with Sarah Massengale as we talk about social capital. And then please stay on after that. We'll do questions and answers and general discussion afterwards. But you're, of course, free to continue making observations in chat as well. Everyone can see that while the video is playing. Now, this is being recorded, and these videos are on YouTube, but they are unlisted. So this is the way you get access to them, is through this class. And wait, I may have not done that correctly. I'm sorry. So we are glad to have you here in this class with us today, and glad to be able to share this video with you today. Well, join us today is Sarah Massengale. I should say Dr. Sarah Massengale, who is a county engagement specialist with University of Missouri Extension. She is in the community development program, but she's also a bit of an in-house expert on this topic of social capital, and thought this would be a interesting discussion. We try not to make it too academic, I guess, but tying it back into neighboring and some of the questions that folks in this program have had. This topic has come up several times, this idea of social capital. Now, there are a lot of different definitions about it, and a lot of different papers today. I found a simple explanation of social capital on Google, right? That's the authoritative source. Today, it just says social capital relates to the ways in which humans interact and work together. So building social capital means improving the way humans interact, collaborate, and cooperate. So that seems like a pretty easy to understand definition, but Sarah's really going to tie these things together for us today. And so, Sarah, thank you for joining us, and looking forward to your discussion and explanation.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me. I love social capital, and I think it's really important for us to think about. And when you were giving that definition there, it actually reminded me why I ended up in community development. Because I started out working in environmental education and land use and natural resources. And I worked for the Aldo Leopold Foundation. And one of Leopold's writing, he wrote St. County Almanac. One of his big quotes is about cooperation and collaboration in terms of the environment and people. And so really, right, it comes down to, for us to help with the land, we have to be able to work together and respect the land. So it was that relationship between land and people. But I really got interested in how people interact also in terms of education environment. So anyway, that's sort of a offside, but it, when you said that, it reminded me that's kind of why I ended up in community development and working with people. I think that relationship and networking is so important. So
yeah, that's a great tie-in, actually. And it absolutely ties into this whole idea of neighboring and strengthening neighborhoods. So.
Right. So I use almost a similar, definition of social capital when I'm talking about it. And I go back to the community capitals that Neil and Jan Flora developed, and that's what you kind of see on the screen right now, these puzzle pieces of community capitals. And if you think about our communities, right, it's not just about financial success or economics, right? Those are really important. We want good businesses, good jobs, the ability to invest in things that are important to us. But for our communities to thrive, it takes a lot of other pieces, right? And social capital is one of those. Just like natural capital, the natural resources in a community, our buildings and roads, that's the built capital. So you think about those as, those are other investments or assets in a community, and individually, right? We can benefit from these different community capitals also. And so think a minute, like, right, we're about at Christmas time. So let's think about the Ebenezer Scrooge story, right? He had lots of financial capital, right? But his employees were not doing well. His community needed help, and he was isolated and unhappy and had lost relationships because of his focus on money, right? So the ghosts came and reminded him that he needed social capital, right? He needed to build those relationships back with his employees and people in the community. So if we think about that story, if we had only defined him by financial success, he was a success, right? So that's why I think we need to think through why it's important to think about all these different assets and capitals in our communities as we're thinking about how we want to improve and make our communities good places to live.
I think Charles Dickens would be really proud of you in that example.
Right, and it's Christmas, a Christmas example. So
yes.
So we think about that too, like in our communities, we're choosing where we want to live based on not just about the jobs anymore, right? We want to be by family, we want good parks, we want schools for our kids where they're going to do well and be successful. We want our communities to be places that support our needs as individuals. And the same with businesses. When they're looking to locate or grow or stay in a place, they're looking for those other amenities and things in a community that are important. And so that's where I think the social capital is such a big piece of that, because it takes people and trusting relationships and the willingness to work together to make some of the things happen that make our communities good places to live. So like you mentioned, it's about reciprocity, trust, leadership, and group membership or networks. And then there's two types of social capital. So there's bonding social capital, which is our really close relationships with family or friends or neighbors, like people that are related to us or similar to us in the same community, members of like a master gardener group, right? But then there's also bridging social capital, which is our relationships and networks that connect us outside of our usual close relationships. So when the Master Gardener group locally goes to the state conference and connects with Master Gardener groups all across the state, that would be bridging capital, because they wouldn't necessarily meet those people in their local communities, right? When I think of like our regional planning commissions, I don't know if those are a thing all across the state, but we have a really strong one. And that one, they bring together all the different county commissioners every couple of months to network and get to know each other and work together on joint projects. So the county commissioner relationships would be like bonding relationships because they're from the same community. But when they go to those regional planning commission meetings and work together on a project that's across a region, that's an example of like bridging capital, where they might not have done that on their own, but now because they have those relationships through the regional planning commission to commissions around the region and in different counties, that's helped bridge the network, right? Does that make kind of sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really important to have both of those relationships, right? We have really strong relationships with our families and friends, but there are times where you need to reach outside your close network. If we think about like a natural disaster, right? We need help to come from other places, or we need to be able to gather resources from the federal government or other places than besides our just local network. So it's really important to think through how we develop those bonding and bridging relationships. And it takes a lot of work. I guess that's the other piece, right? That we need to think about. They don't just happen. You have to build the trust and build that continual trust. Um, and we have to think, the other thing to think about is making sure that our relationships and networks aren't exclusionary. An example of that, when I moved here, I was the outsider, right? So people kind of welcomed me in, but there was a sense of, it took a while for them to get to know me and for me to build trust and join some of those groups and networks. But sometimes it can be hard to do that. And so when we can help make our relationships and networks more open and inclusionary, that can help strengthen our social capital as well.
Yeah, we see that even with immediate neighbors. I think the rule of thumb is like 12 to 18 months
Mm-hmm.
to really develop a relationship. And I would say in my own experience, a few of them went faster than that. And I'd say there's still at least 2 of the 8 that are works in progress, despite quite a bit of effort. They're going to take longer than that 18 months.
Right.
Because it is a two-way street, and that's part of the factor in how long that can take to develop that. But you're right, it does take initiative and it does take effort.
Right. The work is important though, and that's part of that trust building. And think about, if we're thinking about why it's important in our communities to build social capital, there's some research. I promise not to do too much research, but to give you a little bit of some of there's a lot of people that do work on this and study communities and compare and see how social capital influences economic development and other investments that communities want to make. And so, we were talking before we started about Robert Putnam, and he's one of the key researchers about social capital. And he argues that social capital is a public good, right? It takes us as individuals working to build that social capital, but we can also benefit from social capital by even when we're not participating in a particular network. So if you think about, I mentioned like master gardeners, but if you think about garden clubs, right, that plant flowers in the park and make sure there's trees and downtown flower baskets, they're beautifying the community, and it's their social network that's helping that. So we don't have to be part of that to benefit from that social capital. And then sort of the same thing, I guess, like with the county commissioners example, because they're building social capital with a regional network, our communities benefit when they're able to apply for grants collectively that bring resources to the region, but we didn't necessarily have to be part of that social network to benefit in those particular cases. So it's something that we benefit from individually when we participate, right? So when we know our neighbors, we can run over and borrow a cup of sugar pretty quickly. So there's some benefits like that when you have a mentor that helps you get into college or start a new business. Those types of social relationships benefit us as individuals, but that's where we need those broader networks and groups in our community that help us build a stronger community, whether we're participating or not. So that's another big piece of the puzzle too.
Yeah.
And then,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say another researcher who actually was at Mizzou, David O'Brien, was a professor of rural sociology. He's emeritus now. He had done a study that showed that compared 2 communities that had a very similar resource base. They had about the same amount of sales taxes and resources and all of that, businesses. But he found that the community that had stronger social networks and a history of leaders that were willing to work together on projects, that community was more economically viable than the community that had more limited social capital. And so, it was about that those leaders had built the trust and the relationship that they were more quickly able to connect when there were opportunities and address things together, rather than kind of like competing for resources or pieces of the pie. And so that's another one that shows why this is really important in our communities. Even if we're thinking about economic development, that we need these other capitals, particularly social capital, to make those things work.
I heard a speaker a couple of months ago out of Wichita, Kansas, and he actually made the statement that local government should be more concerned about social capital than economic development. that social capital has a bigger, more broad impact than economic development. He made it sound like the social component in this puzzle piece, that maybe even the social component belonged in the middle, that it was kind of like the linchpin for everything else. So did you go to that extreme, or
I think
there's
it's
merit in that?
part of the puzzle. I think we can't solely focus on that, but it definitely is a really important, like top three, I would say, top three pieces that we need to think of in our community. That my puzzle diagram right here, those are the comprehensive wealth model that Pender developed for the Economic Research Service. And he uses these community capitals, but framed from a local perspective. So that's why I put that local context, local actors and priorities, and community outcomes, because he said we wanted to make sure that these things were all being developed in terms of what a community wants and what a community thinks is important, and in a way that benefits the local people and organizations that are there. And I definitely do think that we undervalue social capital when we're doing planning for economic development, that it's a really important piece we need to be thinking about. So yeah, we need to focus on all of those parts of it. We can't do just one, because then we might damage. If we were going to put in a new business, but it was going to tear up one of the best parks in our community, right? It would diminish the natural capital piece. So we need to look at all the pieces of the puzzle when we're making investments or considering opportunities or challenges in our community, because we want all of these pieces to be strong, or to be able to build on the ones that are, sometimes communities have a really strong natural capital, but maybe less built capital, right? So how can we use those assets in a way that protects them, but leverages those to help us, grow as a community? And I mean that more in like quality of life, not necessarily physically grow. But how do we then invest in some of the ones where we might not be as strong? So if we don't have good social capital, how do we build that so that we are better able to take advantage of opportunities and work together? I've seen some communities where there was a lot of nonprofit organizations and they were all doing really good things, but because they didn't work together, they were pulling resources from each other, right? When they could have maybe duplicating services or competing for things. And if they'd found a way to work together better, to kind of build that trust between organizations, they maybe would have been able to leverage resources and do more together. And so sometimes we need to think through that, like how we might have a lot of good networks and organizations, but is there a way to help strengthen that and help serve the pieces in our community? So roundabout answer to your question, I guess.
Well, and it, specific to like neighborhoods, the social capital, as you develop trust and relationships, you're more likely to work together, maybe find a common ground on a problem. I had a conversation last week with the neighborhood association, and they've got a big fuss going on over a fence on common property that's really kind of decorative, but it costs money to mow around. It needs to be repaired. So do they just take it down because it's really only decorative, or do they keep it up and it costs extra money then to mow around it? But it's really causing this big fuss. But they have really struggled in the area of developing trust and relationships in their neighborhood. Mm-hmm. When you have that, then you're better able to find some common ground and working out problems, I would think.
Right, I think so. Because if you have that trust, if something happens, you're probably more likely that you could just go over and knock on the door and say, "Hey, this happened. Can we talk about this?" You had mentioned one time that the police calls had dropped in a community you knew where they'd really worked on building those neighborhood relationships. We have a group in Salem here that's working on housing and trying to help improve the quality of the housing stock. And part of that is we're working to think through how do we help neighborhoods work together better, so that when there's a neighbor that maybe can't get out and repaint their front steps, that the younger person next door could come out and volunteer and help do that. And so taking care of each other in our neighborhoods can help improve housing stock too, right? If we're able to pitch in rather than it not being able to be fixed or things like that. That doesn't solve all things, but sometimes there's some smaller pieces that if we can work on those as a neighborhood and build our relationships, that helps us on a broader community level too.
Yeah, excellent example.
And thinking about that there was a really good article, it's been a little while ago now, but in the Ozarks, they mentioned the title of the article was An Economy of Neighborliness. And I just loved that because what this woman wrote about was she had moved to a place that didn't have a grocery store. There wasn't a lot of resources, not a lot of jobs, but when she got to know the people there, they had some fantastic skills, right? There was somebody that could sew. There was somebody that made, that did food products, right? That were available. And they were just sharing these things among their network of neighbors in the community. And so when she really looked at that, right, those wouldn't have necessarily shown up on any financial dashboard because it was a barter of skills or trading, sort of that informal economic piece. That's still really important, especially in some of our smaller communities. And so they were able to leverage that by working together and sharing skills among each other. And they made a a cooperative store that then anybody that needed something could come in and, maybe they needed something hemmed, but they came in and they, then either paid for that service or traded some other skill that they could provide. And that's a really important piece that I think, have maybe not focused on as much lately. There's a lot of great informal benefits we get that aren't calculated when we think just about the financial market transactions. So that's another piece of our communities that's really important to build on.
Yes, absolutely.
But it goes back to needing trust, right? You're not just gonna help someone out necessarily, or it really takes a little bit of work to build those relationships. That store didn't happen overnight. It took a lot of conversations and getting to know each other and being able to all decide that pitching in and starting the storefront was something they all wanted to do and thought was beneficial to them individually and to their community. So
that is a great example. But we have a long history of doing this in America.
Mm-hmm.
You go back to Democracy in America by de Tocqueville, and he talks about he makes the argument that the single most powerful part of the American experience is the gathering together in associations and doing things together in associations. And now I know this puzzle piece here says trust, relationships, and networks, but I would assume that associations, networks, that's kind of interchangeable word there. I kind of see them as very similar, but he said that was quintessential to the success of the whole American experiment was our ability to work together in associations.
Right, for sure. And I mean, you think about, networks is maybe not the best word there because it could leave out things. But if you think about, if you go to a church, that would be, in the way I'm framing it, a network that you have, but like you said, an association of people that are interested in something similar. When I think you're on the Chamber of Commerce board, right? So that's an association, again, and you're building social capital by being part of that. And so you're building individual capital, social capital with you and the other board members, but you're also then building that bridging capital between Extension and the Chamber of Commerce. So now if the Chamber needed something, they know they could reach out to Extension maybe for some partnership or assistance. So, right, those associations are just as important. And whether it's a formal one like the Chamber, like serving on a board, or just your neighborhood group that gets together to play bingo on Friday nights, or those things are important, and they're definitely a lot of different types of social capital and social.
Yeah, that would be an association. If you have a group of neighbors that love bingo, there you go, the neighborhood bingo association.
Right.
Love it. That is a powerful way to join together, though. So great examples here, Sarah. Thank you.
Sure. And then, thinking about, we've talked a lot about economics, right? And it's important for that, but it's also adds to our health. And that's an important piece right now. We see that with the pandemic, right? We're more isolated. We're not able to get out in our groups like we usually do. And so there's research too that shows that social capital contributes to healthier communities by supporting mental health, being able to help and adapt when you're recovering from an issue or need some assistance there. And so that's another piece of like having healthy communities that's important.
Yeah.
And the last piece I just wanted to, the reason we're talking about this in your neighboring class is like how do we build social capital if we're looking to make some investments in that piece in our community. So being part of this neighboring class is really important, but it also takes the next step, right? So you're building some social capital with the relationships through this class if you meet people, but it takes that next step, right? So, and that's what you've talked about is going out and meeting your neighbors. And then the next step of, trading a skill or doing something that kind of builds that bond and that trust. You help watch when the neighbor goes on vacation, you get their mail for them or something, right? Those are all the pieces. It takes a little bit of work. But think about all the other different ways that you can help build social capital in your community. So we talked about Master Gardeners or Chamber of Commerce, if you're interested in groups like that. Extension councils, right? This is the time of year we're always recruiting for extension members. And that's the reason we want relationships with our community. So part of Extension Council is about building that social capital between Extension and the university and our communities. So there's just so many different ways you can do that. Something as easy as just swapping a skill with a neighbor, serving on a board, mentoring students, right? Mentorships are a really good example of social capital, whether it's a, adult youth mentoring relationship or businesses. If there's a new business starting and you have something that you could help them with, those are all different examples. So there's just so many ways to build social capital in the community.
Yeah, I think you've made a very good case for the importance of that and some real tangible ways that we can do that and really begin doing that in our immediate neighborhood,
right?
With our immediate neighbors, and perhaps even see results even sooner. If you're impatient about results, you could probably see that working on us, starting on a small scale, in a small basis neighborhood first.
Right. Yeah, it's a great way to get started. So
fascinating. Well, we're all about kind of helping develop local leaders as well. So this is all part and parcel of that. So,
right.
Well, Sarah, was there anything else as a wrap up that you were wanting to add?
No, I think that there's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of good resources. We were talking about some books before we started. There's a lot of research if you're into the research literature about some of the key pieces. And David, maybe we can make a list that if anybody's interested, we could share some of those key pieces to think on if you'd like to learn more about social capital.
Absolutely. And then while we're when this video airs in our neighboring 101 class, I'll probably share your contact information in case people would like to follow up with you directly. But and we'll keep the conversation going on this topic as well as how it relates to neighboring. So
sounds great. Thanks for inviting me today.
Sure appreciate your time. This was fantastic. All right. Get that stopped. All right. Well, thanks for hanging in there, everybody. That may have generated some additional questions. I know I've had a few on chat, and it's been good to see lively discussions there. I'll try to address a couple of quick ones. Someone asked me about extension councils, and that's a Missouri thing. Every state has an extension program that's tied to their land grant university. I'm not familiar enough to say exactly how that happens in every state, but in Missouri, every county has a university extension office, and every county has an extension council. And these are publicly elected individuals, ranges from 16 to 20 people on an extension council. And we have one of those in Missouri and in Greene County specifically where I'm at. And then there's a lot of interest, I think, in this asset-based community development idea, which ties to social capital. That will be our focus in 2 months. I mentioned in chat a book, Abundant Communities by John McKnight, and that is all about asset-based community development and as it relates to neighboring and neighborhoods. And like with all books, there's parts that you read and you think, well, now this is a little far-fetched, and maybe other things you think, well, he probably didn't go far enough with that, or he didn't think of this aspect of that. So there's good and bad, to pick from in that book. I'd say one of the best aspects of that book is he talks a lot about creating associations among neighbors, and that being this part of social capital. So that ties back to a pilot project we're doing in Greene County this year, or in 2021. We've got 4 neighborhoods, all very different. 2 of them are Habitat for Humanity neighborhoods, actually. And with those pilot neighborhoods, we're doing quarterly newsletters. We're planning some events in the neighborhood for the neighbors. The quarterly newsletters go to everybody in the neighborhood. There'll be some other attempts to communicate with them. We're also doing a survey of everyone in the neighborhood. And one of the things we're doing with that survey is to create a neighborhood directory. Now, the contact information can be nice to have, but one of the main parts of the directory is finding out what people's hobbies or interests are. We're asking, what are your 3 favorite hobbies, or the 3 things that you feel like you could teach other people about? And when we know that and their interest areas, then from that, trying to build associations within the neighborhood as well. So you have your immediate neighbors you're trying to connect with, but then also associations that could further strengthen the neighborhood. That ties back to the Abundant Communities book. It ties back to this asset-based community development idea as well. So that's a pilot project for us, and there'll be lots of discussion and information that comes from that, I hope. And we'll talk about this further in a couple of months. Another community that's really gone full bore on asset-based community development and social capital. So I know we want to have a little time of question and answer as well. Some of you may want to stay around with that. I just want to do 2 reminders before anyone would leave. Remember, our next session will be January 14th. I'll send out reminders on that. In that session, we're going to actually introduce you to something called NeighborLink in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and how they've used NeighborLink to train residents to be good neighbors and to help put action to dreams. It's an interesting example as well. And then I'd love to hear from you in chat. Chat has been updated. Of course, this recording will be made available in the follow-up email that goes out to everybody who registered for the class. But would love to hear from you in chat if there was something you learned today that you will think more about or maybe implement in some way. Chat is a great way to share those ideas of what you've learned. And while people may be sharing in chat, this is also a good time to go ahead and do question and answer before people start dropping off. If there's additional thoughts, or maybe you're doing something in your community that you'd love to share about, we'd love to hear about that too.
One comment that I heard from Dr. Massengale was that she asked the question, who do you turn to for support that isn't a family or friend, like in times of crisis or a disaster? Or I think the more realistic application of that would be, who do you turn to when you need support that is not planned or spontaneous, or you think you can carry this big heavy thing to your car and realize that you can't. Who do you turn to for that timely support.
Yes, those are great examples. I know in my own life, in our own neighborhood, I really only knew two of the neighbors and really only one of them well before we started out on this endeavor of learning our neighbors, learning their names, learning more about them. And this is one way that plays out what you're talking about, Chet, is that and then in March, my wife was diagnosed with cancer. Now, I will tell you here, we just got her blood test back last week, and she is cancer-free now. So we're thrilled about that, and that's the good ending to the story. And she was diagnosed in March, and because we'd kind of been fostering some of these relationships, we knew that two of these other ladies that lived close to us had had cancer as well in the past. So it was an immediate connection point for her. It was an immediate connection point for them. They talked to her all the time. They brought food over. They did things to support her and encourage her and things. And I think that was a really important part of her recovery as well. And if we hadn't taken the time to prospect in our neighborhood and discover that we had this gold mine around us and neighbors with these types of experiences, we would never have never known that. So that's one example of how it can play out, besides help lifting heavy things or a cup of sugar.
David, I have a question as well, sort of unrelated to that. From all of the work that I do working with neighborhoods, and even in my own neighborhood, I sit on the association board, and there is such an opposition to real engagement and involvement of renters in neighborhoods because they're generally not considered as invested in where they live. Or that's usually the argument against including those people. So will this class cover any strategies or ideas for sort of breaking down those perceptions and barriers?
Well, that's a great question. John McKnight writes about that in that book, Abundant Communities, that very thing about getting renters involved and connected in the neighborhood. I can't remember off the top of his head if he had an outline of some specific strategies in that section where he wrote about that. He probably did, and it's just not coming to me right now.
Yeah, I know it's especially important since Springfield, Missouri, where I live and where we live, is now a majority renter community. We can't keep discrediting those voices.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. And maybe others on the call today or in the future have ideas about how that could be done successfully, but you bring up an excellent point. They do have to be included. Absolutely.
I think that starts with an invitation, though, just like an invitation to anything. I'm a renter. I've lived in the same place for 8 years, and I don't think that disqualifies anybody from taking a leadership role or being actively engaged in your neighborhood. Perhaps more of a mindset or a paradigm shift. But I think folks are maybe waiting longer to buy homes, just like they're waiting longer to get a driver's license or to get married. So long-term renters, I think, should be actively included and considered, an asset to a neighborhood just as much as any homeowner.
This is not a direct tie, but I think there might be some similarities here, and this is some information that will be in that neighboring packet that we're sending out by email to everyone who takes our 10-question survey. But in there's links to a research study that was done at the University of Missouri about 10 years ago. A sociologist that looked at several neighborhoods to determine whether higher income, or I think they looked at this nationally, higher income or lower income residents, which ones would be more engaged and more active in their neighborhood. And their theory was that it would be higher income residents. They had maybe more disposable time or money, and that they would be more engaged. But when they and you can read about this in that research study, their end result was they discovered the opposite was true. The lower income people were more active, maybe because they, where higher income people, maybe if they got mad in their neighborhood or things didn't work out, they thought, well, we'll just move. We can just do that. Where lower income people maybe didn't see that as an option. And there were several other factors. And I wonder, in just having read that last week, if there might not be some similarities with that, even with renters, people who feel like they dismiss them because they think, well, they're just going to be coming and going. They're not going to be here for long. Whereas maybe if neighboring and welcoming really takes place, that might not be the case. Something opposite might actually apply in those situations. Certainly not including them in things is not very welcoming. And if we're going to be, a big part of this is trying to create communities and neighborhoods that are more welcoming. They need to be included, and or as Chet mentioned, at least invited and asked. Well, there is a lot of chat this time, and there's lots of things I'm going to need to follow up on, I think, and I will do that through emails and contacts with everybody registered in the class. I see a question about a Facebook group and for this particular class, and I'm certainly open to what would work best in that. We do have a Facebook page called Becoming an Engaged Neighbor, but it is not a private group by any means. Maybe doing a private group is the best approach.
Yeah, I saw a few responses there in the chat that a few people raised their hands that would be interested in a discussion forum, whether that's a Facebook group or a GroupMe or a WhatsApp. Maybe we can do a survey to gauge folks' interest and what platforms maybe as a follow-up.
Okay. Well, we're certainly open to ideas and willing to do things to keep the conversation going. So, well, again, we'll do a follow-up email. The communication can continue that way, at least through surveys. Always glad to get feedback and hear from folks, and then we'll meet again on our next class is scheduled for the 14th. We always record and send those out, and I'll look at the chat in more detail and follow up on specific questions or ideas as well. And encouraged by everyone's participation. Glad to have you here. The goal has always been to keep this at an hour or less during your lunch hour, and want to be good stewards of your time. So I'll hang on, I guess, in case someone wants to have a specific question of me, but otherwise, thank you for being here. Appreciate your interest and appreciate your interest in your community and your neighborhood and the power of neighboring. So thank you again.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Thanks, guys.